Rishi Sunak will face a day of questioning at the COVID inquiry this morning, where he's expected to be quizzed about his claims that scientists had too much power.
Well, nicknamed Dr. Death by some, the Prime Minister will come under scrutiny for his decisions as Chancellor, including the controversial Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Well, joining us this morning, columnist at The Sun, Rod Liddle. Rod, good morning. Is this the most crucial 48 hours for Sunak as Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that there's any way that Rishi can come out of this very well at all. And if you look at the opinion polls, I think there was an opinion poll overnight or over the weekend which suggested that the majority of people thought that Rishi Sunak hadn't handled COVID very well. That just shows you the state that the Tory party is in, given that Rishi Sunak's contribution to COVID was to hand out vast amounts of money to people for doing nothing, for staying at home, and then to pay for them to have a McDonald's in the middle of August. So I just don't know what a Tory politician can do to win itself favour from the electorate at the moment. And the problem is, I didn't agree with the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and I'm beginning now to have grave reservations about the furlough scheme as well. Where I think Rishi Sunak perhaps has a point is that the scientists had too much power over government policy during COVID, though it would be better put that certain scientists had too much power over the government rather than scientists in general. I think that SAGE was drawn too narrowly and that they didn't have enough experts in from other fields which might have mitigated some of the disastrous decisions which were taken and which we're still paying for now.
But Rod, isn't it up to the politicians to decide whether or not to go with what the scientists advise? Ultimately, can you say that they have too much power if at the end of the day they're just advising and it's up to the politicians who are in charge to decide on policy?
Well, yes, except that they're saying that they have to follow the science. The trouble is the science was drawn too narrowly. It was largely epidemiologists who were deciding what government policy would be, and epidemiologists kind of have an intellectual dog in the game. The problem is that it was drawn, as I think Chris Whitty admitted, too narrowly initially, and later on as well. There should have been other people in there, such as economists, but also oncologists, people who could look at what the long-term effects on the health service were going to be, and the long-term effects on other illnesses other than COVID. And that's why I think there was a problem. And yeah, you're right. Of course, the government can decide not to do what the scientists say, which is exactly what, to his credit, given everything else we know, what Boris Johnson did in the Christmas of 2021 when he defied the SAGE advice and didn't have a lockdown when Omicron came along, and was absolutely right in doing so. I don't think anyone would disagree with that now.
Rod, so much to speak to you about this morning. I hope you had a good weekend.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, mate. We talk about Rishi Sunak and his legacy in the next 48 hours. And Richard Holden, the Tory party chairman who's been in the job about 3 hours, he came out over the weekend and he said it would be insanity to change leader yet again. You look at Nadine Dorris's book, whatever you think, and you hear about how the Tory party just eats itself alive. They're famous for that. An opinion poll as well over the weekend, Rod, right, shows that he has done nothing. There's no bounce. In fact, he's lost 5% from when Liz Truss was in power, for God's sake. I can see the Tory party jettison him. Can't you? Nobody agrees with me around here, but I really can.
Well, I think there are certainly parts of the Conservative Party which want to jettison him. I don't think it would make any difference. I don't think that there's a public appetite to see Boris come back. I don't think there's a huge public appetite to see a kind of bizarre Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson double ticket, to be honest. I think the problem, mate, is that there is a genuine weariness with the Conservative Party, no matter kind of what they do. And I think that's the problem that Sunak's got himself in. I also think he's been an incredibly ineffectual leader, and a leader kind of without principle as well. There hasn't been a principle behind any of his decisions. It's been tacking this way and that in order to keep various parts of his party happy.
Well, might I respectfully suggest that the way he went about getting the job, and I'm not, from the sidelines, it might sound like I'm carping. Peter Cardwell said this morning he did it right. He stayed loyal, but he criticised within. He wanted that job, did he not, Rod? He wanted that job desperately, and I think the reality of it has been very... I think you're right. Weariness is a really good description. People are just... What else can they do, really?
Well, that's right. And also, don't forget, I mean, the Tories didn't really want him. They went through various leaders before finally they alighted upon. It was a kind of palace coup in a way, in that suddenly you had Jeremy Hunt at the Treasury, you now have David Cameron at the.
The Remainers are in charge.
The Remainers are back in charge, which is the way it should always be, isn't it, Jeremy? You know, it's what we expect. So I can't see anything, you know, the Rwanda plan included, which will make the public suddenly say, well, they seem to have got a grip on this country, I must vote Conservative again. I just don't see it. Richard Holden, incidentally, is the MP for me up here in where I am in Weardale at the moment. Not a bad bloke, but I think he can see the leads evaporating everywhere. The one kind of the two bright spots for the Tories are whether Labour can manage to shoot itself in the foot over Israel and Gaza and the majority rich party opposing the leader, but I don't think so. I don't think it's big enough for that. The other thing is if inflation comes down, but it's coming down, and it'll take a long time before that's felt in people's wages, pay packets and so on.
And Rod, do you think that his performance at the COVID inquiry could really be crucial in terms of the public perception of Rishi? Rishi came to all of our... Well, I certainly wasn't necessarily aware of him until his performance as Chancellor. He was labelled Dishy Rishi. He was seen as kind of, certainly from the left, the, quote, good Tory at the time, possibly because of the furlough scheme, etc. But now we're looking at him 3 years on through a very different lens. And I wonder if it's going to really affect his public support.
To tell you the truth, I think that the COVID inquiry will probably knock another couple of points off his opinion poll ratings. I don't see any way he can come out of it well. But then I don't see that there's very much that he could do which would make him come out of anything well at the moment because of the public distaste for the party of government. And you're right. I mean, there was a time when he was the golden boy of politics, Dishy Rishi, as you quite rightly say. But what we've had revealed to us is a very corporate machine politician who. At a time when I think the government, the people actually would quite like a conviction politician.
Well, now this is really interesting, Rob, because, you know, Silicon Valley, here you come, Rishi Sunak. But you're right, he was this sort of, I think Nick's spot on, he was seen as this, what was he? He'll be controlled, he'll be authoritative. But actually, you've just said something, and I have to touch on this. I know you threw it in there earlier. Conviction politician. Even I was amazed to read over the weekend. There are plans afoot, and God knows what the Tory party are like, to bring Boris back and team him with Nigel Farage, fresh out of the jungle. Thoughts?
Yes.
Desperate.
It will not work, and it's desperate. And in fact, I don't think the Conservative Party, certainly not the Conservative Party in Parliament, which is obviously crucial, but also the Conservative Party at large, but more than that, the voters. I don't think they want, you know, Boris Johnson back. I think Boris Johnson did bad things during COVID, but also a couple of good things. I think his instincts were often right, even if the decisions he made were often incompetent. But I don't think there's any great appetite to see him back any more than there is an appetite to see Rishi Sunak. You know, I think people have tired of him. It is very difficult. I thought that during COVID, I genuinely thought, not for the reasons that Chris Whitty put forward, but for just on a point of principle, that we probably shouldn't pay people to go out and have McDonald's. I thought, you know, that's probably not a good idea.
Is it though, Rod? Do you think? And I'm not. I absolutely actually agree with you. Hindsight's great, though, isn't it? You touched upon something there that I think is really interesting, and that Boris Johnson will spend the rest of his life saying to himself. My old man always told me, you go with your gut. I suspect if Johnson and more of them had gone with their gut instead of trying to please all the people all the damn time and going round in circles, we wouldn't be in this mess. I mean, it is frightening, the incompetence that is coming out of this. But I go back to what I say, round and round all the time. What I want from that inquiry is to make sure we're never in that position again, pal.
Yeah, well, we're not going to get that from that inquiry because it's not going to look at the really interesting things. Partly Boris Johnson's fault, of course, for drawing the parameters of that inquiry so narrow. But the more the time goes on, the more you look back and you think, what were the really bad things about COVID? What were the things that we did wrong? And crucially, because Britain alone in Europe it has got fewer people back to work than any country in Europe, and actually the numbers have gone down since COVID. More and more focus will be on this notion of furlough and whether it was necessarily a good idea, where it seems to have been this thing which has persuaded the British people that they never need to go to work again. And so I think that Rishi cannot come out of that terribly well, even if people enjoyed furlough at the time.
Now, obviously, Rishi's in a unique situation because, you know, he was Chancellor and is now serving PM. But unlike a lot of the other big hitters that we've seen in this inquiry, they have no skin left in the game, really. Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, etc. However, Sunak is PM. He can't exactly point the finger at people who are currently serving in his cabinet.
Absolutely.
Is that going to be a tricky situation for him?
Yes, it is. It's very difficult. And there's also nothing to be gained from attacking the scientists because the public, even though the public, I think, are probably wrong on this, the public tends to think that the scientists are pristine and above any form of censure. Whereas I think that probably if we look back in 10 years' time to COVID, we will think, no, we should have been a bit more rigorous about, firstly, making sure that the elderly and the vulnerable were taken care of, but secondly, that our children could go to school and that the economy was able to work.
You know what, Rob? When scientists say it's all politicians, if I was a scientist and I absolutely had proof that, you know, the lockdown was wrong or the lockdown was right, I would be haranguing the Prime Minister until he went with my advice. I think it's very easy. I'm not abstaining blame from politicians, but I do think, who can forget Ferguson heading off to Cardiff to see his girlfriend? I do think that there has to be guilt on all sides. But for me, and I think Nick would agree, I want to learn from what happened, and I don't want that to happen again. No,
I think that's exactly right. But the trouble is the way that Hugo Keith has conducted these inquiries. He has made it absolutely clear that politicians are the villains and the scientists are beyond any form of censure. It's quite remarkable.
It looks like it's set up already, doesn't it, in terms of who's going to be blamed? Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, that's it. Dominic Cummings, everything else is irrelevant. And whilst I think their share of blame is important, I think it needs to be wider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's undoubtedly true. And we should hear from other people. You know, I will bet that there were oncologists at the time, cancer specialists in 2020 thinking, my God, we're going to be storing up terrible problems for ourselves in the future if this continues in the way it's continuing at the moment.
And that sort of misplaced madness where none of us thought or were told, if we give you 400 billion quid not to work or to eat out, you are actually going to have to pay that back. That sort of mad moment.
Indeed. Well, they still, especially the civil servants, still don't think that they should go back to work. It's remarkable. I think there was an opinion poll of civil servants at the end of last week in DEFRA, which is the laziest of all the departments. I think only 29% of those people are back in their offices by now, 29%. That said that 40% of people would resign if they were forced to go back into the office.
God.
You know, it's
Rod,
remarkable.
we've used you for a long time this morning, but my esteemed co-host is going to finish with a question that is never one that you've heard before. I hope you're open to this, Mr Liddle.
It split our viewers today, Rod. Brussels sprouts, love them or hate them?
Love them.
Yes, thank you. Rod Liddle's on my side.
Why?
We agree probably on very few things, I imagine, Rod, but sprouts is up there.
Sprouts is definitely it. But they have to be properly cooked. None of this sort of soggy mush. It's got to be done with a Christmas with chestnuts, a bit of bacon and a bit of lemon juice as well.
Liddle, I have held you in the highest esteem for years. You've disappeared in my mind. Rod, thank you so much, my friend. Always good to speak to you on a Monday.
Thanks, Rod.